Hello again guys, and welcome back to another Big L Devlin video here at the House of Devlin. Thank you very much for tuning in. This particular video is going to be focusing on death and what death meant to an ancient Nordic paganist. And the reason I'm filming this video is, one, it's an important thing to know about because it was quite a big part of the ancient Nordic religion. They didn't focus on death, not like the ancient Egyptians are certainly perceived to have, focused on. They were very much, for living as well. But death was, obviously, for pretty obvious reasons, a big part of their religion, or a big part of the spiritual side of things. And one of the reasons why I'm filming this is to give a Nordic perspective on what death meant to these ancient peoples, because recently Celtic God, who's a YouTuber here on YouTube, who's a member of my featured channels. If you go on my homepage, you'll find a link to his channel. If not, just type it into search bar, Celtic God. He recently filmed a video in response to my Nordic prayer. He filmed a video called A Celtic Prayer, and the Celtic prayer is basically death is my mistress and war is my brother. And he goes then in to explain in very great detail what the meaning behind that prayer is, what the significance of saying those words means, and why it would essentially fill you with confidence or remove any doubt or anything along those lines and make you feel strengthened, and why it's respectful for to the gods, in particular the ones that involved in that prayer, to say such words. Now, part of that's his reasons behind that and the story behind it is he tells this beautiful story which I will not give justice to, so I'm not going to repeat it, so please watch his video. But he gives the story of death. Death is my mistress, and he explains that death, in a very eloquent manner, so as I say, please watch his video. Death is essentially mercy. Mercy for all these creatures that have been, until death came along, trapped within these immortal bodies that would still age and rot. Still, you could still, in theory, be eaten by an animal, and you would experience all the pain, all the suffering of this eternal life being trapped in your body. And so, death was a release. It was a mercy. It was a release from any pain that was so great that you obviously couldn't stand it anymore. Okay, essentially, death is a mercy that releases you from an almost a hell on earth experience. Okay. Now, to the Nordic paganists, it's very, very much different. It'd be interesting, actually, if any of the viewers here are Wiccan. I would love to hear what you think or believe, or what kind of afterlife exists for yourselves, because it's actually some kind of no knowledge of at all. I have looked at Wiccan. I've read a lot of the Wiccan sort of Bible, essentially, the Wiccan books and stuff. But it's something I actually never looked at, was the afterlife aspect. So if you're watching, please feel free to become part of this community and expand our knowledge. But for the Nordic paganists out there, or for those interested in Nordic paganism, this is going to be my account and telling of what death was to the ancient Nords and to people like myself who practice ancient Nordic paganism. What death means, what it is. Now, we don't have a kind of grim reaper figure. We don't have a god or goddess of death. I mean, in Celtic mythology, the gods are genderless anyway, so I'm kind of wrong saying the goddess of death there. But both me and Celtic God actually would perceive death as a female. Now, obviously, as a Nordic paganist, I don't have a goddess of death because there isn't one that exists as such, strictly speaking. There isn't one that exists within Nordic paganism, although, strictly speaking, there's two. Okay, and I'll get into the reasons as to what death and the gods involved in death were now, I suppose. The better place to start than the present. Now, basically, the first god of death amongst the Nordic paganists, these gods and goddesses there's only one and that was one of the goddesses which would definitely be seen as a goddess of death, or primarily her primary aspect was as of death, but the one that would first come to question would of course be Odin. Okay, Odin was one of the gods of death in theory. Okay, and the reason is because he collected 50% of the souls of those brave men who died in battle fighting for him. 50% of the souls that died were his, and he took the responsibility of them, and he took care of them within the halls of Valhalla. Valhalla being seen as one of the heavens that a Viking or an ancient Nordic paganist, but this specifically in this case, a Viking would be able to enter and go into. Now, it's not everyone's cup of tea. Most of you here, if not all of you, will have heard of Valhalla. You may not quite know what it is, so I'll explain it. But the halls of Valhalla were formed by Odin when Odin gained the ability of foresight, when he drank from the water at the roots of Yggdrasil, which is the real tree, the tree that holds up all the realms and connects them all. When he drank from those waters, this is where essentially fate is sort of contained and watched over by the three Norns, okay? And that's why when you drink the water, you gain this incredible foresight. You can see the death of basically everyone. You can see the entire future that is ahead of you. And obviously, consequently, you learn your own fate. And even though fate cannot be changed, it's inherent in every creature that lives and in every creature that dies, that you try to preserve yourself as best as possible. And now gods, believe it or not, in Nordic paganism are very, very capable of dying. Okay, and so Odin didn't want the death that he saw in his future. He didn't want Ragnarok to happen, or at least his death within Ragnarok to happen. And so he decides to create the halls of Valhalla. Now, the Vikings or the ancient Nordics in this are very specific on right down to the number of doors and the heights of the doors and the number of windows that exist within Valhalla itself. And the details I will let you find out, because I have no idea off the top of my head, as I don't really see it as an important thing. But imagine this, it's a very, very big hall. It's very grand and it's very imposing and impressive. Enough said. I'm not going to say that there's 892 doors, I think it is, or anything along those lines. Doesn't matter. Okay, but Valhalla was created, this great hall where all the souls of dead men found worthy of Odin were taken from the battlefield and directly to the halls of Valhalla, where they would live the rest of their afterlife until Ragnarok came. Now, that was why they were picked. The reason that Vikings had the ability to go to Valhalla is because Odin created it, because he wanted an army. He wanted an army of the very best fighters he could get his hands on, which were, going to be these men who had died bravely on the battlefield. He wanted their souls. He wanted them to fight Fenrir for him. They are there to fight and to die for Odin during Ragnarok, and they're there to protect Odin and potentially change fate during Ragnarok. And so if you go to Valhalla, that's the honor that you get. An amazing honor. Not only do you get to live in the halls of Valhalla with your brothers and your forefathers, not only do you get to live and feast and fight and die every day with these people and with Odin himself watching over you on a daily basis, but when ultimately the end times come, the end of the very end, the apocalypse comes, your death will have some more meaning than simply a fading into nothingness. You get to die for Odin himself. If you die, and if you win, you have saved Odin's life. The Allfather's himself will exist because you have slain Fenrir. Now, obviously, we know the story of Ragnarok. I haven't told it on here yet, but in the story of Ragnarok, Fenrir is killed, but it's not by men; it's by one of the other gods. One of, I believe, I don't know if I'm correct in believing, but Celtic god's personal favourite god, or certainly one that he has a lot of respect for, and that is Tyr, or T. Tyr, T. I'm unfamiliar with the pronunciations, but Tyr is essentially the king of the gods in Celtic mythology. In Nordic mythology, he's just one of the sons of Odin, very powerful, very influential, but he's the slayer of Fenrir. Spoiler alert for when I tell you the story of Ragnarok. But men do obviously are there for a purpose, and as I say, for a lot of people, for the Vikings, for people who lived a very martial lifestyle, this was the ultimate heaven, because what happens is you wake up, you eat your breakfast, you wash it down with mead, with no hangover, you walk out of Valhalla, and then you fight the very best warriors of all time. Each and every single one of you are the greatest warriors of all time. You get to fight against each other until there's literally no one left alive, until one's left, essentially. And when you're all dead, or when the battle's over, you all come back to life with no injuries, with no pain, nothing. And you go back into the halls of Odin for the evening, where you eat and you drink and you party and you enjoy yourselves. You enjoy yourselves with your brothers and your family, with your fathers and your father's father and that. You get to drink and fight and just be with them for all eternity until the day of Ragnarok comes. Now, this for a Viking, and bear in mind I'm very specific there, for a Viking is heaven, okay, or one of the heavens that he would wish to attend. It's a heaven where all berserkers would wish to attend, because berserkers were individuals who were completely dedicated to Odin, and they were Vikings themselves, but they were a specific type of Viking. What about? But the thing about Vikings is they were the martial elite. They were essentially the samurai of ancient Nordic civilization. Not every Japanese person in medieval times was a samurai. Most weren't. The majority, probably 99.9% of them, were peasantry. Farmers, fishermen, things like this. And it was the same for the ancient Nords. There was perhaps a great percentage of 1% being Viking, but they were the martial elite of society. They weren't born into it. Anyone could become a Viking, but you had to be a good fighter. You had to have that talent. You had to have, to some degree, some money to be able to fund or be part of a Viking expedition. Okay, because a Viking expedition is simply a raid. Viking means to go out and raid. It's just the word to raid, or to go out, essentially, in the ancient language. Now, so as I was mentioning, in Japanese, this is another martial culture where the warriors did not fear death, because the Viking warriors, they didn't fear dying on the battlefield, because if they died on the battlefield, they go straight to heaven. So what's there to fear? It's a good thing. It's something to embrace. You don't welcome death. You go down fighting and killing as many as you can, but you don't fear it, because there's a great life waiting for you. And really, it was the same. Very different but similar principle. Well, same principle, but different sort of mechanics behind it for the samurai. They didn't fear death because of Bushido, the art of Bushido, which was a form of Buddhism, if I understand correctly. I'm no expert on samurai, but ultimately they believed that they would have a greater plane of existence when they reincarnated. I believe they would live very well in their next life if they served and died well for their liege and master, their king, ultimately their shogun. Okay, but for the Viking and also the Japanese peasantry, this kind of existence doesn't give anything to the people. So there were other afterlives that were for the common people. But before we get on to that, I will mention there were a few other afterlives where a Viking may find himself existing. And these are the important ones to consider, really, because the peasantry one is kind of basically like modern day heaven. Basically, I'm just going to mention it now. I might as well deal with the peasantry now. If you're a fisherman or a farmer, you weren't involved in war in any way whatsoever, or fighting or defending your family or anything like that, but you were feeding the people and stuff like that, you were good, you had a good soul, and you lived a good life, you would go into some kind of afterworld in one of the realms, probably in Vanir, or well, Vandenheim, sorry, I imagine. You go to a heaven that existed within one of the spirit realms, essentially, and you would just continue to live your life like it was on Earth. That's what the Vikings believed, that when you died, you just continued the life that you had on Earth, but without all the pain, without all the misery, without the suffering. So you would never, for example, see a child die, which would be very common 1,000 years ago. At childbirth or from illness or anything like that. That didn't exist. Disease didn't exist. Famine didn't exist. You would always have a full stomach. You would work the land, but you would never grow tired. You would always be full of energy and full of joy. And so that was the heaven that awaited the mothers, for example, and the farmers and the general tradesmen. Okay, and the mass majority, as I say, are females. Although females were allowed to fight, females were allowed to be Vikings, and they were called shield maidens in this case. But they were rare. They were very, very rare. Okay, is archaeological evidence showing shield maidens existed, because for a while it was iffy. It was up there whether they actually existed or not. They were an urban myth, but there is archaeological evidence proving 100% that female Vikings did exist. Very much so, but they were rare. They were much rarer than the males. Okay, it wasn't a 50-50 split. You'd be lucky to see a couple in a generation. But nonetheless, they did exist. Now, if you wasn't a farmer and all the rest of it, but you just live a nice heaven, which everyone would like, that sounds like a nice kind of heaven. You would either go to Valhalla, as I've just discussed, and so Odin essentially would be your god of death, but he was not the god of death. He was responsible for half of the warriors that fell in battle. But if you hear me mention half the people who fell in battle, that's half the people who fell in battle fighting bravely and fighting ferociously and fighting, well. And I believe really metaphorically these days, and I think it also meant it back then, it didn't mean that you really had to die in battlefield, in battle, fighting someone. It may have been more literal in the past, but I actually see it as a metaphor that you are fighting for your life, fighting to better yourself, constantly fighting to achieve. Life is difficult, life is cruel, okay, and it doesn't give you necessarily everything you want. It doesn't need to give you anything. Life owes you nothing. You must make it of yourself. Sometimes you have a bit of luck and things kind of just fall into your lap. But the mass majority of your material possessions and your achievements are a result of hard goddamn graft. And it's that constant fighting right to the end, never giving up, always, no matter how hard life gets, always fighting to strive to better yourself. I think that is applicable in a modern paganist to trying to attain, a place in Valhalla, maybe. I might be wrong, but that's the way I would see it. It would be a shame to have everyone punished who wants to go to Valhalla if they don't join the army and die in the army, sort of thing. But anyway, the other half of the men who died bravely in battle, and this was the first half because she had first choice, would go to Freya. Freya was the goddess of war and love, and she was one of the gods of death, like Odin. And she would, unlike Odin, when Odin selected his dead, he sent shamanistic projections, familiars essentially, which we would call Valkyrie, down to Midgard to select the souls of the dead and bring them back. He was very powerful in magic, and that's how he did it. It was like his two ravens, Memory and Thought. They were not pets. His Jerry and Frecky, his dogs, they were not pets. They were part of him, but they were shamanistic projections. They were part of his personality. They were part of his mind and his physical body in some ways, but he was able to project it using magic to achieve certain things. For example, the ravens allowed him to see everything within all the realms because you could just send them out when he was asleep. This is what he used to do when he used to sleep. He sent the ravens out, and so even though he was asleep and not really aware of things, in his dreams he would see everything that's going on within the 9 realms. So that was what Odin was about, really. And the Valkyrie were a similar thing to the ravens. They were just a shamanistic projection. They were not individual goddesses of their own right. They wouldn't exist apart from when Odin sent them out. But their role was to collect the souls of the dead, and their appearance was very, very specifically explained. They had wings, they could fly, and they were always female, and they were armoured, and they carried spears and shields. Okay, so it's that typical sort of almost, if you see the, Britannia, the female Britannia, like that, but with wings. That's kind of what a Valkyrie looked like. Very similar. Okay. Now, Freya, there's no description that I've been able to find anywhere within any of the old texts that describe how she collected the dead. So the manner of which she came down and selected the dead, I don't know. Maybe she came herself. Maybe she used shamanistic projections because she was more powerful at magic than Odin, so she was more than capable of doing it. Or she may have had another god come on her behalf, or some other mechanism in place. But she had first pick of the dead. And the ones that she selected would have had to have died bravely as well, and I believe they were collected for the similar purposes as Odin, to help protect Freya during Ragnarok, but I believe they had additional purposes. I'm not sure what, because unfortunately there is minimal information on what you would expect to be a hall of Freya, whatever it would be called. But it was actually a meadow called Folkvangir, if my pronunciation is correct, and that translates roughly to Meadow of the Dead or Meadow of the Armies. So she did collect her armies and her dead also, but their existence within that afterlife has never been described as to how I know, up to what I know of. There's no written texts that have survived the Viking Golden Age describing Folkvangir. Okay, so there's a lot of Valhalla, but minimal amounts of Folkvangir, but it was a heaven, very well sought after. And I don't think I should really mention it, but I will briefly. When I was in my car crash, my heart had, for all intents and purposes, stopped. It was trying to pump, but there was no pulse. If you checked my wrist, there would have been probably no pulse, because my electrical signals in my heart was all messed up. And I, before I kind of woke back up and, tried to become conscious again to protect my girlfriend, I remember I was lying in a meadow with a stream and sunlight, and I was at peace. And so I don't know, maybe, just maybe, because my heart, at all intents and purposes, stopped, and I believe that was probably the day that I was fated to die, that maybe I had gone to Folkvangir. I'd been selected by Freya to fight for her. What an honour. But I don't know if that's true or not, but it's, well, I know it's true. I know I experienced that, but the way I see it is, that was Folkvangir, because I knew nothing of Folkvangir until after the crash. So it's not like I'm projecting my knowledge of a potential afterlife and think, like people who sometimes when they're in operations and they die and stuff, they see a bright light in it and they assume it's heaven and stuff, which they may be correct, but I had no idea about this meadow. I thought it was just another hall, and I was wondering why I dreamt of this meadow, or it felt like I dreamt of this meadow. But now it makes a bit more sense that I've done my research. So maybe I'm destined for Freya. We'll see. But anyway, there were other afterlives, without getting too personal, beyond Freya's and Odin's afterlife. There was an afterlife where if you died by drowning, because bear in mind, the Vikings, they didn't want to fear death. They didn't want to fear dying in the battlefield, and they didn't. Or at least they shouldn't have. They probably did, but a lot of their fear was taken away because they genuinely believed they had if they were faithful to the gods, they genuinely believed that there was nothing to fear from death. So those who genuinely believed in the gods wouldn't have feared death. But obviously, why risk sailing over to a foreign land when the chances of drowning or your ship scuttling on the shores are quite high, even with the superb craftsmanship of the long ships that the Vikings used to use, with their superb navigating skills and stuff like that. You can't predict a storm. A storm will come when it comes. Now, we might be able to predict it now to some extent with technology, but even now it's hard to predict. For them, it would have been almost impossible. And you can't predict when the waves are necessarily going to be super strong. You know when there's high tide and there's a low tide, but when there's a super high tide, you can predict it, but it's hard. It doesn't always, and it can happen randomly. And so dying in the water was something that you had to accept as a Viking. It was a potential fate, not just dying in battle, but dying by drowning. Especially as a lot of their warfare prior to raiding coastlands was amongst themselves on ships. So the chances of drowning there was far more likely than it was otherwise would have been during a raid, because they may have been thrown into the sea, for example, by someone that they were fighting. And so the goddess Ran, Ran, she was one of the gods of the sea. She was one of the daughters of the god of the sea. Okay, and she was a giantess actually. She wasn't an Asgardian or anything like that. She was a goddess. She was a giantess, and she selected the drowned men to come down to her realms, and they lived an afterlife with her, where she and I think her sisters basically had a massive orgy every night with these drowned men and a massive feast and stuff like that, and that was your fate. I mean, it's not a bad fate. You either go to Valhalla, or you go to Fort Vangir, or you go and have an orgy every day with Ran and the other goddesses that she invites to a party, so to speak. And so it's not a bad way to end up in many respects. But there was one particular bad way to end up. This was a place reserved for cowards. Cowards would 100% end up there. And for people with evil in their hearts, who committed vile acts, unforgivable acts, or on the whole, just lived worse lives than they did good lives. And this realm where you were destined to was when basically no one else wanted you, and you would descend into the realm of hell. Now, hell was ruled over by the goddess, or the giantess. She was a giantess also. She was one of the daughters of Loki, and she was called Hel, or sometimes Hela, but her true name was Hel, and she was named after the realm where she found herself when she was kicked out of Asgard. And this was an unpleasant place. This was your typical hell of Christianity and Islam. You wouldn't. This is a place where you got tortured and your soul was unhappy. You would do anything to avoid going to this place, but it was quite easy to end up going there if you didn't abide by the rules, so to speak. And so hell ruled over this sort of under realm essentially. And she had a purpose for the souls, just like Odin did, and also Freya, of course. Ran didn't have a purpose for her soul. She was just basically having fun until the end times. But Hel had a purpose. She knew that she was going to be involved, or maybe she didn't know, but Loki was guiding her, certainly to some extent, towards Ragnarok. And during Ragnarok, she was going to lead an army of the dead these vile and wicked men, she would lead them into attacking Asgard. And so this was one of the armies that attacked Asgard during Ragnarok. The dead men who were cowards and things like that, and they were forced to fight for her. So that was the other potential realm you might end up in. So if you were just a good person who wasn't a fighter or a Viking, you could end up in basically the equivalent of modern day heaven, where you lived your current lives and they progressed and continued to progress, but without any real negatives in your life. Everything was joyful. Everything worked out in the end, sort of thing. You could go to Valhalla, or you could go to Folkvangir if you died on the battlefield and you were chosen by either Odin or Freya. You could go to Iran if you died by drowning, and you could go to Hell if you basically weren't suitable for any of those others. So that is what death was seen as by the Nordic paganists. And that was their options. Now, the process of death itself was simply an event. You didn't die because you were struck down by God. You died because you were fated to die. Fate was a massive thing in Viking mythology. You were ruled not only as a human, a mortal man, a woman. You, as a god or goddess, would also were ruled by the fates. The fates ruled everything, and you could find yourself separated sometimes from the fates, or you could alter fate slightly using Seder magic. But ultimately, for most people, in most circumstances, your day that you're born and the day that you die are set in stone and will never, ever change. And so your day of death is just an event. It's just another day. It's just when your life, your existence within Midgard, if you're obviously a mortal man, just comes to an end, and you progress onto an afterlife, and your body then enriches the soil where it wouldn't be buried. Most ancient Nords were burnt, but your body would just be left on Midgard, but your soul would essentially move on, or your spirit, I think, is a better word than soul. And so really death itself was never really looked at. It was, I don't know, it just had less significance to an ancient Nord. Death was death. Whatever, get on with life. That was their approach. Okay guys, thank you. Bye bye.